is Revolutionizing Recruitment with Kathleen Duffy, the art of attracting, acquiring, and retaining talent. Here's Kathleen.
Welcome back to my conversation with Laura Putnam, the founder and CEO of Motion Infusion, a well-being consulting firm that helps leaders build healthier, happier, and more innovative organizations. Laura, one of the steps that I really liked about the framework is how you go from expert to agent of change. And what I've been seeing, especially with my younger employees, are the new ideas that they've initiated. So for example, we have a book club and fitness and wellness challenges, and we have instant messaging group like Just Fun and a pets group. Another one is called Inner Critic, and that gives people the opportunity to share when they are feeling the weight of the world, or if somebody makes them feel like they've totally screwed up at work. And then everyone can chime in and say, yeah, something like that happened to me. And it's an idea that never crossed my mind, but it's been a real game changer here. And I'm wondering if you're seeing simple things like that work too.
Yeah, one of the messages that I deliver to leaders and managers a lot is that, again, along the theme that you're mentioning, you do not have to be an expert. You do not have to be a therapist. It's really about human to human connections that people are really seeking. And so how can every workplace foster more peer-to-peer connections, as you're speaking about, more peer-to-manager connections, and then also peer-to-senior leader connections. And then certainly, connections amongst, senior leader to senior leader, manager to manager as well. And so, for example, 91% of millennials reported in a recent Monster Intelligence survey that they want to be having conversations about mental health with their boss. And again, I think so many of these managers feel like, oh, well, I'm not a therapist. This is not my role. And no, you're not necessarily a therapist, but you are a human being. And this is really about starting to generate some simple systems that are practiced consistently that really help to make people feel appreciated, not just for what they do, but for who they are as human beings. And also help them to feel like that they're a little less alone. So I love this inner critic initiative that you're talking about. I have a very active inner critic, Kathleen.
So don't we all?
Yeah. And so when I can share with someone an experience where I've had this overactive inner critic, and then they corroborate that and they share that they too have had that, then that makes us feel like that we're part of humanity, that we're not isolated in feeling this, but instead we're really part of a shared human experience. And I think that that's so fundamental to where so many of us are right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm glad that you brought up the Monster Intelligence survey, because I do want to talk about how employees want to talk about mental health with their bosses. And, as I was looking at that survey, I was thinking about a young woman who I've known for well over 25 years. And she's an engineer, and she's worked for a fast growing tech company and really on the fast track for a high potential leadership role in the organization. But she recently left the company to focus on her mental health. I know that that's not the only person out there that's doing that. There's a lot of high potential talent that is leaving our organizations because we don't know how to start the conversation as their bosses or as their managers, because, we think about it again, my generation, we avoided it. And if I, was having an issue, somebody pushed me over to an EAP, right? They just said, go and take care of it. It's your individual problem. It doesn't have anything to do with work. But we can't sweep this under the rug. And this generation is not going to let us sweep it under the rug. Thank you very much. So how do we begin? Because it's hard.
It's so hard, Kathleen. And I think that's actually a first place to start is, how do we tackle this taboo topic of mental health in the workplace, especially when we have long standing ideas such as when we come to work, we check our emotions at the door. And with mental health issues on the rise. For example, a study that came out from Boston University, speaking of Boston University,
Mm-hmm.
showing that rates of depression have tripled for Americans since the onset of the pandemic. And interestingly enough, to your point about the example that you just shared, there's a research showing that a lot of those high performers are actually a lot of the ones who are suffering from anxiety the most.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if we're not tackling this head on, um, and moving beyond just let's identify the individual's risk and kind of just refer them out to EAP, which by the way, over 90% of large organizations have EAP, but on average, less than 6% of employees take advantage of it. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously,
Mm-hmm.
there's a huge disconnect there. But as long as we continue to treat it that way, again, you just take care of this on your own time. We don't talk about this at work. We're not going to resolve the issue. So, one of the things that we need to do first and foremost is that we need to start to look at this as a culture and systems issue. What is the infrastructure that might be in place that is potentially driving some of these mental health issues? So, a Gallup study found that the top drivers of burnout in the workplace have nothing to do with the individual and everything to do with the workplace itself. So it's things like toxicity tolerated, it's things like perceptions of unfairness, it's things like work overload, it's things like unreasonable time pressures. And perhaps the most dramatic example of this that I've seen is a case that happened in September of 2019, in which there was one naval ship in 1 week, in which there were 3 suicides. And this was on the heels of the Navy having invested heavily in mental health initiatives and specifically in suicide prevention. But the problem was that, again, this was under the assumption that mental health is a personal issue, not a culture issue. And so one psychologist who was interviewed said, might it be about the environment itself? What if we were to resolve that so that troops are less likely to become suicidal in the first place? And eerily enough, this scenario in which one ship, 1 week, 3 suicides actually repeated itself yet again in April 2022. So one thing I often ask organizations and their leaders to consider is our workplace a naval ship in the making? And are we going to start to tackle some of these systems issues as opposed to instead just relying on the individual? So I think that that's probably the most important step in starting to more meaningfully address this, is starting to look at this from more of an outside in perspective, and instead of just providing those individual resources and expecting individuals to take advantage of them. Instead, we start to take a deep dive into some of these larger structural issues, such as pay inequity. I mean, that's a big driver around perceptions of unfairness. And so if you really want to make a difference around mental health issues, how might you as leaders start to address issues like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a huge topic and a whole nother podcast, right?
Totally.
So let's talk about the culture piece, because I have the booklet that you gave us at our session on what's your company culture. And I'd never been through a culture check-in exercise like this before. And I think that it really does illustrate what you're talking about, taking this outside in approach. And maybe you could, for our, because we are not visual here, it is a deck of cards. It's probably what 10 or 15 of them. And there are different pictures and scenes and whatnot. And maybe you could walk us through that, just a couple of those exercises that you did to help us, especially for visual learners, to be able to really identify how people are feeling about their culture at that time.
I love that exercise. So to kind of frame this up, so it's a booklet that has 10 different images that are a range of images from, peaceful ones like light through the trees. It's a scene in the woods with light kind of penetrating through the trees. Another one is a balloon that is kind of going over a canyon. Another one is an explosion. Another one is a broken chain link. Another one is Sherpas carrying heavy backpacks. Another one is an image of holding hands. And another one is a horse getting kicked in the face. And so I present these different images often as a starter for workshops, and which I ask particularly leaders to step into the shoes of the people across the organization, and just to imagine, if you were to present these images to the average employee in your organization and ask them to pick the one that best captures their day-to-day experience when they are at work, which one would they choose? And what's so powerful about images, as opposed to my just asking the question, what is the day-to-day experience for employees in your organization? It's hard for people to really, they tend to speak more from their logical side and kind of give you statistics. But when you show an image, especially that one of the horse kicking the other one in the face, it goes straight to the heart. And people really start to look at this more from a place of empathy. And isn't that what effective leadership, especially in this challenging time that we're in, isn't that what it's really all about? It's about leading with empathy. And so when we can show these images and say, put yourself in the shoes of your people, which are they choosing? And then I also like to turn the question around, which is, where are people versus where would you like them to be? Where's your ideal? And again, having an image to move toward is much more inspiring than having a list of words to go after. And again, that's really ties to this idea of shifting our mindset from expert to agent of change. An agent of change really speaks to the heart, and images certainly speak to the heart more so than yet another survey.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a really powerful exercise. And I also thought that because we were in a room of senior leaders, how everyone had a different perspective on, and why they picked the image that they picked. I thought it was a very, very powerful exercise.
And there's no right answer on it. It's really
Mm-hmm.
a human to human conversation, like we were talking about before. That's where change really starts, is with human to human conversations where we're not just relying on the experts, but instead we're relying on our own intuitive human understanding.
Yeah, definitely. So Laura, you published your book in 2015, which makes you a pioneer, right, in this wellness industry. But it seems like it took this crazy pandemic to push this into the conversation. And I'm curious, from one author to another, what's been the reaction to your book today versus when it came out in 2015?
Such a great question. I mean, I certainly think that a silver lining of the pandemic and the fallout from it, particularly now the toll on our mental health because of the pandemic, has been that pretty much everybody, particularly leaders, recognize that well-being is no longer a nice to have, but it is a must-have. And people are voting with their feet. They want well-being in a true sense, a true and authentic self. And if they're not getting that with the organization that they work with, then they're either actually leaving or they're quietly quitting. And so every organization really recognizes that they need to prioritize it. So certainly, when the book was published, it was very much still in the era that, one is that it's kind of fluff and it's peripheral to core business objectives. But also, it was also in the era where it was like, well, I need to know what my direct return on investment is on this. Am I going to actually get a reduction in my healthcare costs, for example? And so much of the conversation has been around less around what's the return on the hard return on investment, and more what's the return on value. How is this a bigger conversation? So these things like perceived organizational support, people want to really know that when they come to work, as we've talked about, that that they're supported and that they're cared for. And I think that value conversation has become much more front and center today, whereas in 2015 it was much more around what's going to be the direct benefit to our bottom line.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, the whole thing around empathy is key, because one of the things that I always share with my leaders is, you just don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And it could be something like their dog is ill, as opposed to a child, right? Or they're caring for their parent now. And there's just so many other things that come into the mix now. And sometimes we just need to remember, especially for those of us that are like, okay, let's just get started into the conversation, that we might need to just say, have a little check-in and see how people are doing. Because I've even had some, check-ins where people didn't even want to talk about work. They just had to talk about something that was going on in their personal life and get it out.
You're so right on that. And I think, again, this gets back to managers and leaders feeling like that they have to be A, experts, but B, oh, I don't have time for this. But the opposite is true, which is if we don't take some timeouts to just see people as human beings first and foremost, because you're absolutely right. We don't know what's happening to people, and we don't know what has happened to them in the recent past. I mean, you may recall that exercise that I did in the talk, Kathleen, where I asked people to consider, what was that moment in which the pandemic became real for you? And for some of us, the pandemic was just a minor inconvenience. Whereas for others, it was the most profound loss that we could experience. So we don't know what people have gone through as a result of the pandemic, or what they might be going through from other issues. And so what every manager and leader needs to keep in mind is that it's those simple rituals practiced consistently that can really make a difference. So case in point, I just came back from speaking to a group of leaders with the Pipeline Construction Association. So like macho guys, right? And I was talking about mental health, and which is talk about an environment in which people don't want to talk about mental health. There you go, right? But one of the leaders came up to me beforehand, and he had heard me speak about a month before. And he said, there was one small takeaway that I took from your talk, which was your suggestion to have a weekly touch point with every team member, and just to ask them two simple questions. What are you working on, and how can I help? And he said, since your talk, I have now carved out a time every Friday, 10 to 11:30, in which I take the time to touch base with every one of my team members. And I just ask them those two simple questions. What are you working on, and how can I help? And he says, you cannot believe the difference that has made, not only within our team, with what they are now bringing to their teams. And he said, I would say that the more that these heart to heart kinds of conversations where people are seeing one another as human beings, and the level of trust has doubled within our organization from that one simple ritual.
Well, that's great, because I was just going to ask you, what are the one or two things employers can do today to get started and ensure their employees are going to thrive at work? And I think you've just given us two really great questions and an activity to do with all of our direct reports.
Another one I love, Kathleen, is 531, which is beginning every meeting with taking 5 deep breaths, naming 3 good things, and committing to 1 random act of kindness. And this is a ritual that I've seen a lot of managers have embraced after going through our Managers on the Move program. And again, the intention behind it is to really just start to engage with one another first and foremost as human beings. We establish the relationships first, and then we start to get into the work, because having that foundation of trust and strong connections, that's what accelerates the capacity to do great work. That's what accelerates performance. So when every team is an oasis of well-being, a safe harbor, a bright spot, that's when it can become a pocket of excellence. That's where high performance happens. So for example, a study that came out of Google to look at what is the most important factor in predicting a high performing team, and that is a team that has a high level of psychological safety. And what are those key factors in having a high level of psychological safety? One is that it is a team in which there's relatively shared airtime. So what can every team leader do to make sure that every voice is heard? That can help to boost psychological safety, again, which in turn accelerates performance. And the other key piece is that the team members pay attention to social cues. They're really noticing one another as human beings. And again, those simple rituals can help to accelerate that.
Well, I think that's going to be, those are some really great, takeaways to conclude with, because attracting and retaining talent is still and will probably always be one of the top issues on a CEO's agenda. And by taking the time to do these things and to build a culture where people can trust each other and to build strong connections is going to be key.
It's so important. And, Kathleen, the research shows, this is coming from Gallup, that those employees who are not just surviving, as we talked about with the Maya Angelou quote, but are thriving, they're actually 81% less likely to leave. So well-being is good for people. It's good for the bottom line, and it is essential for building a high-performing team. So you give me any metric that matters to your organization, whether it's retention and attraction, it's profitability, it's innovation, it's safety, it's absenteeism, and I'll show you how it connects to well-being.
Well, that's great. Laura, thank you so much. You've given us so much today. For those listeners that want to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, I'm very active on LinkedIn. For example, I have a monthly LinkedIn Live in which I bring in experts. Upcoming guest is on December 14th with Dr. Ron Getzel with Johns Hopkins, one of the leading scientists in the nation measuring the impact of workplace wellness initiatives. I'm also active on Instagram and Twitter, and you can also go to the Motion Infusion website. There's lots of resources that you can download, and in fact, I just launched my Wellness University. We've got our first online course called Got Engagement, which is all about engaging with well-being. So lots of resources that are out there.
Well, that's great, and congratulations. Well, and as a person who has seen you in action, I can highly recommend you as a keynote speaker for organizations. So I hope that you will reach out to Laura and learn more. So, Laura, thank you again for spending some time with us today to sharing your expertise. And I know I personally am looking forward to continuing to follow you on social media, but I also look forward to staying in touch with you professionally.
Likewise, Kathleen, thank you so much for having me as a guest.
You're so welcome. And that's it for this episode of Revolutionizing Recruitment. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically will get my new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love if you left me a review so more folks like yourself can discover the show. Until next time, take care.
This has been Revolutionizing Recruitment with Kathleen Duffy. To connect with Kathleen or to learn more about recruitment research, go to duffygroup.com.